At this time, you are going to look at, listen to, and pay attention to a Chapter 2, Section 1 review. These are going to be pages 28 through 35 in your 8th grade American history book. Last year, you either had Mr. Canavy or Mr. Coker, and you learned the first 4 chapters of American history. Instead of Mr. Googler and myself, Mr. Fike, reteaching you all of this, because you had it last year, and I'm sure that you paid attention and did well, we have a review set up, and you will follow this format for the review. Number 1, listen to and follow the narrated review of what you've learned in 7th grade. This is nothing new to any of you. Whenever you finish doing this, you will take a review test for this section online only. You're going to have to access it by using a computer or an iPad. Number 3, if you score anything less than 100%, you must retake the test on your own time until you get 100%. Everybody needs to get an A on this. 100%. Miss none. I'm going to give you time in class. Mr. Googler is going to give you some time in class. You can take it once in class. If you score anything less than a 100%, you must retake it and resubmit the test. So pay attention, and you will be good to go with this review. Welcome to 8th grade. The first Americans. Everybody sitting in this room right now is an American. You probably take it for granted that you're an American and that you have the freedoms that a lot of people fought for. The first Americans, also known as the Native Americans. We need to find out how they got here. Some of you remember exactly where we are going from last year. How did the Native Americans become the Native Americans? Pay attention and listen to the review. Why is this important? Some of you are saying, why do I need to learn this? Well, because you're a living, breathing American and human being right now. History. You're going to hear Mr. Googler and myself say this all the time. History is a giant story. It's a story of us. For us to understand why our country is the way it is today, in 2013, you have to understand why man is the way that he is today. The first Americans are the ancestors of the Native Americans. The way that they lived their lives shaped our lives, and at a great cost to them. They are going to play an important and crucial role all year as we learn about American history. So you need to understand all of the basics. To adapt means to systematically fix yourself according to the changes around you. For instance, it's nice and warm out right now. Some of you are wearing shorts. In 3 or 4 months, it's going to be very cold. It's going to be snowing. Hopefully, you won't be walking to school in a pair of shorts. Occasionally, one knucklehead will, but most smart people will adapt, and you will put something on to keep you warm. That is an adaptation. Human beings, all living things, they all adapt. If not, they're not going to exist. If you don't change according to your environment, you are going to die. People all over the world look different from one another because their bodies had to adapt to the environment in which they live. A lot of the physical attributes of human beings and any living creature is a product of where they live. The same rule applies to the Native Americans. They are all different. Not one Native American group is the same. You probably heard this last year. You're going to hear it a lot this year. Native Americans were all different. Every single group of them were different. Everybody in this room is completely different. You are not all the same. Imagine how boring, lame, and terrible it would be if everybody looked, sounded, and thought exactly the same. This map of the world, of course, is a Mercator projection. This is your basic modern map. You have North America, Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica down here at the bottom. The starting point, according to most scientists, many of them believe that the starting point for mankind, human beings, is right around this area of Africa, known as the Great Rift Valley. Now, I'm not here to change your mind on religious beliefs and things of that nature, but many scientists agree human beings began here in one way or another. And eventually, we multiplied, we traveled, and we filled in almost all of these spots that you see on the map. Pay attention. We'll get you there. This is the basic United States map. Missing, of course, Alaska, which is in the northwest, and Hawaii, which is in the southwest, about 6 hours from California if you were in a plane. Notice Appalachian Mountains, Great Lakes, Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades, lots of mountainous terrain. If you were a human being living thousands of years ago and didn't have the things that we had today, traveling would be very, very treacherous and pretty much impossible. Chapter 2, Section 1. Our story begins roughly 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, the Earth was a lot different than it is today. A good portion of the Earth was covered in ice, which means the Earth was in the middle of its last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago. Most scientists believe that man began in Africa and started out in small groups. Human beings, of course, need a few things to survive. We need food. We need shelter. We need water. We need air. These groups, of course, do what every other living creature does. They look for food and they multiplied. 20,000 years ago, they looked for food and they multiplied. These small groups got bigger and bigger and bigger. They traveled looking for food. The food that they ate, they hunted. So they ate animals, and they picked things that grew naturally from the ground, berries and such. Last year in 7th grade, you probably learned this, that eventually these small groups got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they went in different directions. Eventually, one brave group would cross from what is today Russia over the frozen area around the Bering Strait to what is today Africa. Most scientists believe that this is how the Native Americans eventually got to North America. Back then, during the Ice Age, most of the water that you know on the planet Earth today was down about 300 feet. That's approximately the length of an entire football field. The water levels, the ocean levels dropped to about 300 feet or more where they are today. Because it was the Ice Age, a lot of the water, instead of being in the ocean, was on top of the land in the form of ice. So they were able to cross, because of this Ice Age and this happening and the water levels dropping, from Asia into what would become Russia, across the Bering Strait into what would become Alaska, all the while hunting animals and growing population. If you look at this chart, you can see here is North America. This is approximately how far the ice came, all the way down to what would become the Great Lakes. And over in this area, today if you look, this area in the top left is pretty much all water. Back then, they were able to cross because of the Ice Age and the water level. This map gives you a better indication, complete with some basic dates. Notice, if you start here, where it says number 1, this is the Rift Valley of Africa. Scientists believe that this is where the human race got its start in one way or another. Number 2, these small groups of people started to travel and look for food, hunting and gathering. Eventually they moved south into 3 and 4. Now this isn't taking 1 or 2 months. This is taking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years for these groups to originate down here where number 1 is, all the way into 2, 3, 4, what would become Australia. Now notice right above where it says number 2, there's another arrow. It says Europe. Scientists believe that these small groups continued to populate and continued to go in their separate directions. The Europeans, eventually the Australians. Look up here. It's going to take thousands of years, but groups of people are going to continue to grow and they're going to continue to move, all the while chasing food that is migrating. Eventually, small groups are going to get all the way up here to number 6, what is now Russia today. Because of the Ice Age, they were able to chase food, woolly mammoths, Other animals that existed back then. Saber-toothed tigers, yes, they did exist. These small groups of human beings hunted them with tools that they made, crossed the Bering Strait into what would become North America. Thousands of years later, and millions of people later, they would become the Native Americans that we know today. Scientists believe that this is how the human race started and continued to get to where we are today. If you look down here, this is what many scientists believe that early man may have looked like. Cartoons, of course, exploit this and make them look goofy. You've seen Fred Flintstone and guys like that. This is Neanderthal man. Most scientists believe that this is what early man looked like. An example of what they would have chased. Woolly mammoths did exist. Of course, they are extinct now. Imagine having to bring this down with nothing more than a stick with a sharpened rock attached at the end. It's you versus this animal. Needless to say, whenever this animal was brought down, it would feed an entire group of people and clothe people for a very long time. This is what it probably would have looked like. Buffalo, saber-toothed tigers, woolly mammoths. This is how they ate. Eventually, like I told you before, on page 31 in your book, these small bands of people would populate and spread throughout what would become known as North America, Central America, and South America. Eventually, the Ice Age ends. A lot of the ice melts in the Bering Strait and other places in which the ocean levels and water levels were down continued to fill back up with water, trapping, for lack of a better term, the human beings as to where they eventually settled. Human beings do what all living creatures do at this point. They begin to adapt. Different climates, different regions. Some places they ended up in were cold. Some places they ended up in were dry, were hot, were moist. They had to adapt. And therefore their culture developed because of where and their adaptations that they needed to develop. Evolution. Evolution comes from the root word evolve. To evolve means to morph into something better. Evolution is a theory. A guy by the name of Charles Darwin, you either heard of him in science class or you will be hearing about him in future science classes, was a scientist who went to a far-off place called the Galapagos Islands and studied finches and other creatures. He came to the conclusion, or decided, that because of his studying, he found out that nature causes very small, slow, gradual physical changes. When we say physical, that means changes to the body, in living things according to where they live. Living things change according to what their environment gives them. This enables them to survive. It is called adaptation. Charles Darwin came up with the idea of evolving human beings. Eventually, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, something happened. You learned about this last year. This is huge. No longer did human beings have to chase animals and continue to move. Remember, wherever the animals went, that's where the humans went. They never set down roots until humans got smarter. Eventually, they discovered how to take a seed, plant it, tend to it, water it, make sure it gets enough sun, and eventually grow their own food so that they don't need to travel around anymore. Farming is discovered. Woohoo! Farming. This enabled human beings to stay in one place. You no longer have to chase your food. You can simply grow it. Now, they did not stop hunting, of course. Bands of people, mostly men, would go off and hunt, sometimes for days, weeks, months, and bring back some meat to supplement the food that they have grown. Human beings are getting smarter. They're adapting. Farming was huge. Now you could, yes, stay in one place, and because you didn't have to leave to go and chase your food, you could stay in one place. Human beings populated. They had kids, and their kids had kids. And before you know it, you have a lot of people living in one place. This is the beginning of a town. Villages developed because of this, because people stayed in one place. Eventually, villages turn into towns. Towns turn into cities. All because of farming and to stay in one location. This is what your basic village thousands of years ago would have looked like. Notice the living areas are sort of in the middle, an area in the middle to cook some of the food brought in from the hunt, and the fields surround it. Everybody worked for the same goal, to survive, to eat. Because of this, and because of the different environments that people settled in, some cold, some hot, some dry, some wet, cultures emerge. When you have a lot of people living in the same area and in the same environment, different cultures will emerge. The environment shapes most of the culture. Human beings build shelter, one of the things that we need in order to survive. Different environments provide human beings with different materials to build shelter. If you lived in the forest, you probably built your home out of trees. If you lived in the desert where trees do not grow, you probably built your home out of adobe, maybe moist formed sand. Maybe you dug a cave into the side of a cliff or lived in a naturally occurring cliff if you lived in that environment. If you lived in a very cold environment, like in the Arctic region, you did not build your house out of trees, there weren't any. You built your house out of what you had. The environment gave them ice, they built igloos. You probably get the picture, you're smart children. Because of the environment and because of the culture, religions develop. You've all heard about Native Americans who lived in the desert, who prayed to the gods of rain so that it would rain. Religion is developed because of where they live. Languages, a way to communicate. Think about it. If you lived in the woods thousands of years ago, you developed a language, you probably had a word in your language for a tree. However, if you lived in the desert thousands of years ago, you probably had no word in your vocabulary for tree, or ice, or snow. Languages develop where you lived. I just want to take you through a couple examples of places that are very close to us right now. In Ohio, in Illinois, thousands of people migrated thousands of years ago to where we live right now. Roughly 3,000 years ago, until about the 1700s, there were a group of people called the Moundbuilders. Why? Because they built mounds. They traded with other Native American groups. They had religious ceremonies based on their environment. And they built mounds. Most scientists believe that they lived on top of these mounds and used these mounds for religious purposes. But these are ancient civilizations that are roughly an hour, maybe 2 or 3 away from where we are right now. In Ohio, a group called the Hopewells built something called the Great Serpent Mound. Archaeologists have been digging at this constantly for decades. On page 33, there's a picture in your book, and it gives a little bit of an explanation in the caption, but the Great Serpent Mound was built to honor the serpent, one of their gods. Here it is right here. You can see that it's a national park, I should say, and it's protected. You can walk around by looking at the sidewalks here. And this is roughly 800 feet long, and it's been here for hundreds of years. Religious purposes, sometimes the people who were the high-end people in the tribe lived on top. This might be for whenever the rainy season came and the land's flooded. If you lived on top of these mounds or built up places, you probably lose everything because of the flood. Another group of people called the Mississippians, in and around Illinois, right around where Chicago is, built something called Monk's Mound. It's massive. It looks like a huge pyramid, 16 acres. They had a city of over 50,000 people. It was called Cahokia. Your book says 30,000 people. Depending on what source you listen to, I've read all the way up to 60,000 people. It was a massive, thriving environment based on people who built a culture there, environment. Here's what it looks like today. It doesn't look like much. Every single ounce of this dirt was brought in by hand by people thousands of years ago. Eventually the civilization moved on for whatever reason, but there were civilizations built right where we are right now. Here's a better view. Once again, where you lived, your environment determined how you were going to live and what your culture was going to be. A group called the Anasazi and the Hohokams, they lived in what would become the southwestern part of the eventual United States, out where Nevada and Death Valley and Arizona is today. The only way that they were able to survive in that environment was to irrigate. This is when you dig and bring water from one place to the next. All right? The Romans did it thousands of years ago by building aqueducts. The Anasazi, Hohokams, and people that lived in the desert southwest did it so that they would be able to survive too. Eventually they figured out that, wow, there aren't any trees out here in the desert, we need shelter. They figured out how to make something called adobe. They got sand, collected some moisture from plants, and whenever it did rain occasionally, and formed them into bricks and baked them out in the hot sun. Eventually they became clay bricks. They were called adobes. They also took advantage of the natural cliffs that were in and around the area. Once again, their environment, it determined their culture. Their reign ended in about the year 1200. But eventually, the Pueblos would come along and sort of pick up where they left another Native American group. This is in and around the area of Utah and Silver City, Nevada. This is an ancient civilization that used the environment, what nature gave them, to form bricks, to make adobe homes, and this was thousands of years ago. You can see that they did irrigate. On the top right here, you can see that there are two basins, or sort of like mini swimming pools, where they irrigated the water, and the water would eventually flow down and fill up the bottom ones. The top ones were usually for drinking, the middle ones for washing, and the bottom ones for bathing. And yes, you would bathe in the same water that hundreds of people bathed in before you. It's kind of neat because you could drive out there today and see evidence of these ancient civilizations that lived in the Southwest, in different parts of not only North America and South America, but the entire world. So what you need to keep in mind is, according to the scientists, the human race started in Africa thousands of years ago, adapted, hunted food, eventually traveled, multiplied, and became the Native Americans that we are studying this year in 8th grade. Their environment gave them certain things that they would use to survive. In this case, if you lived in the wooded area, you would build a home like a longhouse out of reeds.
This is an example of a Native American longhouse. Obviously, this Native American tribe lived in a wooded area, cut the trees, small trees, bent them around, stuck them in the ground, and had them tethered together with other things that they found naturally. Now, these big long houses would house sometimes dozens and dozens and dozens of different family members. And they had a raised floor, and they were sectioned off. The middle of the longhouse would usually be the cooking area, and everybody slept in their sort of designated apartment areas. But what you need to understand here, guys, girls, the Native Americans figured this all out on their own. They adapted. They gained the ability to use whatever Mother Nature gave them, whatever grew in their environment. That's what they used to survive. Not only to eat, but to put shelter out of. And eventually their culture and religions developed from using what Mother Nature gave them. So that's what you need to know. That's how most scientists agree that the human race started, from a certain part of the world, and over thousands of years, because of the conditions that the Earth was under, the Ice Age, it lowered the ocean levels and enabled people to chase food without even knowing it from one continent to the next. All the while they multiplied and became the Native Americans that we talk about today, the American Indians. Good luck on the test, and remember, you need to have 100% on this. You can take it as many times as you want. You'll know exactly how to get onto classroll.com, and good luck.